Today, we're going to try to use OpenTelemetry with Jaeger. So what is OpenTelemetry? Basically, OpenTelemetry is a set of APIs, libraries, agents, and instrumentation for collecting distributed traces and metrics from your applications. So it's basically a standard way to instrument your code and collect telemetry data. And it supports multiple languages. If we go to documentation, we can see the languages here, and then we can go and, getting started. And then we can dive into the details here. So tracing is a method for monitoring and profiling your application to understand exactly how your requests flow through your system. For example, you can associate an HTTP request with the SQL database calls that are being made, as well as any other traffic that's maybe going out to other services. So the benefit there is you can see the whole picture in a single trace, and it's easier to identify bottlenecks, latency issues, and other performance problems. So then we have Jaeger. Jaeger is an open source end-to-end distributed tracing system. So basically it provides a web-based user interface for viewing traces and analyzing performance data. So basically the OpenTelemetry data comes to Jaeger, and we can use Jaeger to view it. All right, so let's add OpenTelemetry to our application. Now, in our case, I'm going to be using our kind of mature application that's been around several years, and it already has some OpenTelemetry instrumentation. So we're going to take a look at what it has, and then we'll take that as a starting point. Now, the OpenTelemetry documentation, provides all these dependencies you can add for everything that OpenTelemetry supports. In our case, we're not going to be using all of that. We're just going to be using part of the OpenTelemetry spec. So we're going to be just using these libraries over here. Let's see if I can make this not highlighted. Okay. So we've got the OpenTelemetry libraries. The trace gRPC, because we're going to be using gRPC protocol to get the data over to Jaeger. We've got the SDK here, Go SDK, and then we're using a Gorilla Mux as our HTTP router, and then we're using SQL to view our SQL transactions. So those are the dependencies we're going to be using. Let's see. There we go. And then let's go to the code itself. All right. So first we're going to talk about adding it to our router, right? And that's the simplest part, right? And we've got some configurations here that we can enable OpenTelemetry. And then we also support other tracing tools like Elastic APM. But in this video, we're just focusing on OpenTelemetry. And then all we have to do is this line to add the tracing to our HTTP router. Now let's take a look at SQL. We're using MySQL database. It's a little bit more complicated. At initialization, we register the MySQL driver here with some options. We disable some errors and disable some telemetry that we found was kind of clogging up our logs. And then we actually rename how the trace shows up, and we're putting first 100 characters of the query into the actual trace name, which could be useful so that you don't have to go into the trace to see what it's all about. So we do all this, and then when we actually open our database connection, we we use this driver name down here. We use it down here, and then we open here. We're using this wrapper, but inside is just calling SQL.open right here. All right, so we instrumented our HTTP router and MySQL driver, but then we actually need to output the data, output the traces, so that Jaeger can pick them up. And this is where all those other OpenTelemetry libraries come in. So let's go look at OTLP trace, where it's used here. Here we go. Basically, this is all the code we need. And we're talking about creating an OpenTelemetry exporter and trace provider here. Right here and right here, and we set the provider. And of course, for details, we can go into the details in the OpenTelemetry documentation, as well as other things you can do with OpenTelemetry. All right, so we instrumented our application. So now let's go look at Jaeger. Jaeger has a basic configuration, which is very simple, right? We just launch this command to get started. Now for collecting metrics, it's a bit more complicated. It requires additional services, Prometheus, and an OpenTelemetry collector. So with telemetry, things can get complicated very quickly. And one of the benefits of Jaeger is you could just get started just with this, which is pretty user friendly, right? Our configuration wasn't that complicated in our app, and then we just have to do this to get started. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go back here, and in our case, we actually don't even need all these ports that were mentioned, and here it provides the details. We're just going to be using this port, right? We're using gRPC protocol to get the data over to Jaeger, and then we want to see our user interface, which is, here we go, on this port. So let's go ahead and launch Jaeger. All right, looks like it's already running. Let me kill the old one. All right, let's try it again. There we go, we have it running, and now we can launch our application. But there's a couple things we need to do with our application. As you saw in the configs, we have our own configs, and I have set the environmental variables for this already to enable the tracing. And then we have a couple OpenTelemetry configs we need to set. We're going to specify server name. I believe this may be optional, and then we're going to actually tell OpenTelemetry, where to send the traces, right? And this port 4317, it's the one we specified in Jaeger. So Jaeger is getting the traces. So now we actually start our application. I have a helper script here. Let's go. We got some security measures here. Let me see. I think maybe I have this one running too. Okay, I restarted this and looks like things are running. So let's go back and go to our application. So we're here, and then we're gonna just go, hit the API, get some data, and then we're gonna open the Jaeger UI at that port 16686. Here we go. All right, so by default, this is how it looks. That comes up. I've got my service here. Let's click Find Traces. There we go, we got our traces. And I know I went to this host here, so let's find the trace for that host. So I can go here to Operations. If I type host here, it does narrow the search down, I believe. And then I can click Find Traces here. So let's go ahead and take a look at this trace. And this is what we have as our trace here. So we can see SQL statements, and the SQL statements themselves are broken up here. We got query, prepare, exec. So we can see we're getting quite a bit of detail here. We got quite a number of SQL queries here for this single HTTP request. And then we can see the ones that are taking the longest. We can take a look at this one saying, okay, what's going on here? Let's dive into this. And then, we can go and debug this further. If we identified this query as a bottleneck in our application. Let's take a look at the actual HTTP request, see what we have here. We're getting some data. We're not seeing kind of the body, request body, response body, or the headers, but we're getting quite a bit of useful data here. So overall, right? Let me close this. Close, expand. That's good. Okay. So overall, what we're seeing here is the performance data, right? So if we had a known or suspected bottleneck, we would open up Jaeger, we would take a look at this, and we would actually see which parts of our request are taking how long. And then we can go in, make some changes, then rerun Jaeger and see how things are different, right? So this seems like from a software developer point of view, from like your day-to-day work, this seems like the primary use case for Jaeger. Of course, in production environment, this is, has additional use cases, and that's typically where you would see Jaeger used as a production environment, is where you basically would monitor your application continuously. Maybe you would use sampling to kind of reduce the amount of data. You wouldn't, gather the trace for every time this call was made, maybe 1%. And then you would use metrics, and you would see, like, on average, how long is the call to an API endpoint's taken, right? And maybe, perhaps you have some performance expectations, and maybe you can set some alerts when those are not being met. But from a kind of a day-to-day developer point of view, the fact that it's the use case of OpenTelemetry and Jaeger is limited to performance kind of makes it sort of a niche tool, right? Like I mentioned, if for general debug, it's not that great because I'm not seeing the details. I'm not seeing the request body, response body here, at least out of the box. Maybe there's probably a way to instrument that in. Let's see. Another thing is that these spans, if I go back and I just say all, right? Well, we can just take a look. 462, like, I know some things are missing, and like, I have to know about spans that are missing, because if I forgot to instrument something, it's not going to be obvious. And in our application, I know we're missing some instrumentation. There is some special API endpoints that are not instrumented. We're also using Redis database, so we would want to add instrumentation for that. We have some outbound HTTP requests that are going different places, and for a complete picture, we'd want to instrument that. And in addition, our server is doing kind of cron jobs and some asynchronous processes that we would want to instrument. And I know we can partially see those because we're seeing these top level top level spans, right? I'm seeing this top level span, but I know this is actually part of a kind of a cron job, and this is sort of a bug, right? We need to wrap this in its own span. Let's see, other things. I kind of found it a little bit hard to search. I couldn't just go here and just type star host star. That didn't work. You could do it here, but only if you're using Elasticsearch or OpenSearch storage, right? So it does have that documentation, so you could figure out. It'd be nice if, this, star search came out of the box. It feels like that's something users would expect. Also, I have to kind of refresh this every time. Like, it'd be nice if I just said, okay, I'm interested in, these traces, right? Maybe more than one. Well, yeah. However, and then I just want them to show up as they come in. So I don't have to click this button and see if new traces came in all the time. Minor UI things. But yeah, I think OpenTelemetry is useful. It has its place. There are other alternatives like Elastic APM, but then OpenTelemetry is open source, so that's a big benefit. All right, that's it for today.